Hey folks, so today we're going to discuss Buddhist economics. What might it look like? What might we consider when we're thinking about Buddhist economics? We'll look at a couple of recent books to help us. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, and if you're subscribed, then you'll find out about these new talks whenever I put them up, which will roughly be on Mondays, plus maybe a few extras here and there. So Buddhist economics, what might it look like? There's a certain kind of, I think, similarities between a couple of the most recent books that I've looked at in this. One is called Buddha on Wall Street, which is by Vadaka Lin. He has a background in economics, but he's been a labor leader. He's also a member of the Triratna community, if you know what that is in England. So there's a certain amount of the book that is I should say, Triratna oriented, if you know what that is. It's around the person of Sangharakshita, who was the founder of the group. So there's a certain amount of quoting from him. But it's a very interesting book. The second one is more recent, by Claire Brown, who is a professor of economics at Berkeley. I believe that her specialty is labor economics. As a sort of a practicing economist, this is a little bit more maybe credible in that sense, if that means anything to you. But anyway, those are the two books we'll be looking at. And I think there are some very strong similarities between their approaches. Both of them are involved in, I would say, a significant pushback against what might be called laissez-faire economics or laissez-faire capitalism. This notion that comes from the middle of the 20th century, roughly speaking, that the invisible hand, and a notion again that comes much earlier from Adam Smith, that the invisible hand is going to give us the best possible society, that to the extent that government intervenes in economic activity, it will only be intervening for the worse. And so the more that the government stays out of economic activity, the better we'll all be. That's the sort of premise behind, or the conclusion, if you like, behind laissez-faire economics, that both of these books will be taking a significant question with. This kind of attack on laissez-faire economics is nothing new within the economics profession. There's a relatively well-known split between what are roughly speaking called the saltwater economists and the freshwater economists. Saltwater economists being the economists on two coasts, the west coast of the United States and the east coast, universities. And the freshwater economists tend to be centered around the Chicago School and the center of the country around the Great Lakes. I mean, of course, this is just a rough idea, but to give you a rough idea, people like Paul Krugman, Amartya Sen, Jeffrey Sachs, Joe Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, and many others are involved in this kind of pushback against, and many of them are in fact Nobel Prize winners, pushback against traditional laissez-faire economics. So we shouldn't come to this kind of discussion thinking that the kind of opinions that these two authors I'll discuss put forward are somehow, wildly out of the mainstream. They're not. Roughly speaking, we could say that their concerns lie in four different areas. The first concern would be, how do we as economists, or how would an economist or somebody thinking with an economics background look at happiness, look at human happiness? How do we increase human happiness? How do we make people happier, rather than just trying to make them, on average, more wealthy? How do we reduce inequality? Okay, which is related to the first question. But economic inequality is a big deal. It seems to have a lot of negative consequences. What are those consequences? How important are they? How do we deal with them? That's another issue. A third issue would be the waste economy. Much of what economists look at really seems to skirt the notion of waste. I mean, because look, as long as everyone's getting more wealthy, as long as gross domestic product is increasing, so it might seem, waste is just sort of a byproduct that we can kind of forget about. And of course, these two books, as well as many other economists nowadays, would push back on that notion and say that minimizing waste is also another desideratum, another thing that we should keep in mind. And finally, and related to that, I would say another major issue is the environment. Of course, very much related to waste. But in many kinds of circumstances, the environment is something that ends up getting pushed to the back burner when we're dealing with traditional laissez-faire economics. It's not something that we can monetize, that we can quantify in a monetary way very easily. And so it's often left out of equations when we think about increasing human wealth. We don't think about the downsides to the environment. And of course, there are many other related issues to these having to do with labor and many other things, which I would recommend you read the books to get an idea of. But I'm just trying to think about the general background and interest that these two authors come at when they're trying to figure out the economics within a Buddhist framework. And related to these issues is the question of how to measure these four different desiderata, these four different things that we're concerned about: happiness and waste and the environment, how we are to measure these things so that we know whether we're doing well or badly. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, it shouldn't matter if we can't measure them, but that's a little bit too simplistic, because if we can't measure what we're trying to make better, it's hard to know whether our policies are going to be successful or not. And a lot of the argument from a political standpoint is going to be, just by necessity, are these things successful? Are our policies successful or not? So for example, the standard measurement that economists use when they're trying to figure out whether economic policies are good or bad is GDP, gross domestic product. How much does a country produce on average in gross? Does that go up year over year? Is there an increase in GDP? How much is that increase? Obviously, GDP is itself very difficult to measure. It's kind of a theoretical construct of a kind, but at least we have a good past history of making these kinds of measurements and having that argument. So we have something relatively understood when we're talking about GDP. And both of these authors, but in particular Claire Brown, spends quite a while arguing about different kinds of measures that we might use instead of GDP if we're trying to measure in a way that captures more of what we think is really beneficial to the end products. In other words, when we talk about GDP, we seem to be leaving out a whole bunch about the environment, about inequality, about waste, and so on. And so maybe we can come up with some kind of a measure that will include all of those. And it's going to obviously be more complicated, more complex than GDP. It's going to involve a whole bunch more things, but at least we should begin that argument or begin that discussion. And as she says, a lot of work has already been done about this, so it's not like she's reinventing the wheel, but she's just trying to bring these things up. Now, having said all this, I think there is a very, to me, an interesting question. Maybe it's a side question, but one that I think is important in this context, the context of this particular podcast or video cast or whatever YouTube thing, which is it Buddhist? To what extent is what these two authors are writing about really Buddhist? And this is where I think the two authors have quite a big difference between them. Claire Brown, as an economist, really comes at this almost exclusively from an economic standpoint. She does wave at some aspects of Buddhism at the beginning, in particular aspects of Tibetan Buddhism. She seems to have some background in Tibetan Buddhism. Let's say in particular, she mentions Indra's net. Indra's net is an idea from, I believe, 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era, a Mahayana notion that the universe is sort of like a net, an infinite net in all directions, a three-dimensional infinite net. And in each of the nodes of the parts of the net, there's a jewel, if you can think of the universe that way. And each jewel is such that it reflects all of the other jewels in the net, so that there's this kind of infinite interrelation between all things. And in particular, there's an interrelation between the microcosm, that is to say the individual jewel you're looking at, and the macrocosm, that is the whole universe. And this is a way of sort of giving a metaphor for the interrelatedness of all things that we find in many aspects of Mahayana Buddhism, later Buddhism. I think this particular metaphor of Indra's net actually comes out of really Neo-Hinduism. It's more of a Hindu kind of notion of, again, the interrelation between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the jewel, which I think in many ways reflects the Vedic, Hindu, Brahmanic notion of the Atman, or individual self, reflecting or being reflected in the Brahman or the universe as a whole. And so while these do then become Buddhist notions, I think it's important, at least for our information, to know that they're not really within early Buddhism. This notion of the universe all being interrelated or all being one, which Claire Brown uses to great effect in her book to sort of get across a notion of being interested in the environment and our effects upon the environment, is not really something we really find in early Buddhism. That maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe we don't really care about that, and we can say it's in Mahayana Buddhism, it's in other religions, it's in contemporary physics, for that matter, this interrelatedness of all things. On the other hand, Vadakalin, in his book, The Buddha on Wall Street, which I mentioned at the beginning, is, I think, much more careful in drawing lots of particular inferences from early suttas that we find in the Pali Canon. So he is much more, I think, I would say, invested in trying to demonstrate that the Buddha might have argued for something like the kind of liberal economic theory that he, Vadakalin, is putting across. I think there is some reason for agreement with Lin about this. Certainly the Buddha wouldn't have liked a lot of the excesses of modern capitalism, modern laissez-faire capitalism. Certainly he would have had things to say about great inequalities within society. But on the other hand, the Buddha, we know, had nothing against making an honest profit. He had nothing against wealth per se. He did not believe that wealth was evil. He was not the sort of person who was going to throw over the money changers at the temple. On the other hand, he clearly did believe that wealth was something that should be got away from insofar as we were going to reach the final goal, because after all, his monastic communities, one was not allowed to handle wealth. And to this day, monastics within the Theravada tradition are not allowed to handle money. And I think that this is some indication of the Buddha's concern with wealth per se, although within a lay context, he clearly was not as concerned, and he believed that lay people had every right to make a profit, and indeed, his own Sangha was supported by those profits indirectly. So I think that if we look at the Buddha's work as a whole, we'd have to say that extrapolating very much about how we're supposed to act nowadays in such a complex economic world is going to be something of a stretch. We're gonna have some trouble really extrapolating a lot of that from the early texts, which again doesn't mean that we shouldn't believe it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight for it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't argue for it, but it does mean that we're going to be doing a certain amount of extrapolating that really goes beyond the evidence within those texts. Second related question is this stuff, this Buddhist economics that's being propounded by these two authors, is it really economics? To an extent, economics is supposed to be at least a descriptive enterprise. That is to say, it's supposed to describe the way the economy works, the way monies flow. It's supposed to give you a description that if you do this to the economy, that will happen. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification. We all know that economists are far from perfect at predicting, but that doesn't mean they have nothing to say. In both of these books, I think their task is more one of prescription, of telling us what we should do, rather than description, that is to say, telling the way things work. And again, I'm not saying that's a problem. What I am saying is that there are certain aspects of economics or certain economists who might say, this is fine, but it's not really economics, it's more ethics or politics. It's a political kind of move rather than an economic move. So to an extent it's not Buddhist, and to an extent it's not economics. What it is, I think, is a kind of a liberal political move to try to make a better world, which is something that is in line with many things that the Buddha would certainly have agreed with. But it's also in line with people from other religions, liberal Christians, liberal Jews, I'm sure liberal Muslims as well, might agree with virtually everything or everything in these two books when it comes to economic doctrines. And of course, liberal people who are completely non-spiritual, non-religious, atheists who have no interest in Buddhism, if you were to take all of the Buddhism out of these two books, I have no doubt that they would also find a great deal of agreement within a certain kind of left-wing community. As I've said, many of the economists that both of these authors rely upon aren't Buddhist to any degree at all. But they would probably be in agreement with virtually everything in these two books, or at least a lot of it. Let me say a side note that there is, of course, going to be a great deal that's controversial that these two authors say. I think Claire Brown, as a practicing professor of economics, sticks a little bit closer to the middle of the road, and so there's a little bit less that is really outright controversial, I think, in what she's saying. Of course, it comes from a particular political background, a particular kind of left-wing background. But if you buy into that, you're going to buy into virtually, I think, most everything that she says in the book. Vadika Lin is a little bit farther, I think, on the political spectrum, and is not a professional economist, and so I think does push the boundaries a bit here and there. But I think, again, for people who are interested in something that's a little bit more boundary pushing, Vadika Lin's book would be very good too, and maybe even you would like it better. But what I would suggest is that we consider these a good first start, but then in a sense, really what we need is a general secular approach to this problem. And one that, taking on Tibetan Buddhism again, the Dalai Lama has argued for in a couple of his recent books. That is to say, a kind of a general ecumenical kind of liberal outlook on economics, on politics, that sort of keeps the religious aspects to one side. And I think the question for both of these books is, to what extent do we really need the Buddhism there? Understood that Buddhism is giving us a lot of ethical hooks here to try to understand economics, or to try to come at economics from an ethical background rather than a simply descriptive background. But the question is, would we really lose any of their conclusions, their political, their economic conclusions, if we simply said this is the way we should be doing economics nowadays? These are the kinds of economic ends to which we should be striving, and it has nothing to do particularly with Buddhism. So what do you guys think? I think this is a great time to bring in some of your responses, some of your reactions. I'd be interested to hear if you think that the Buddhism in these books or other books is really adding anything of value, or whether it's simply a sort of a springboard to get us thinking ethically about economics, at which point we really leave the Buddhism behind, as it were, and we're just doing a sort of a more secular kind of enterprise of liberal economic and political thinking. But anyway, to finish up, The Buddha on Wall Street by Vadika Lin and Buddhist Economics by Claire Brown, both very good books. I think for me, Claire Brown's is a little bit tighter. There's a little bit tighter argued, but again, a little bit less overtly Buddhist. Vadika Lin's is a little looser, not quite as well written, but also more Buddhist in the sense that he spends much more time trying to actually bring the Buddhism in. How successful, that's a question, but at least he's trying. So thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed. If you're new to the podcast or new to this video channel, welcome. Glad to have you here. If you've been here before, then really glad to have you back. And again, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Consider leaving a thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you don't. Leave a comment if you have something interesting to say or question or whatever. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.